Shabbat Shalom, everyone. The year that I was ordained as a rabbi, my best friend from childhood was graduating from medical school. And for a couple of months after ordination and graduation, when we spoke to each other on the phone, we would greet each other with our titles. Well, hello there, Rabbi Zelony. How are you doing? Well, I'm fine, Dr. Wheeler. How are you? And we did this until we could stop giggling about it. We had changed our names, and the change in our name was a reflection of a new turn in the road on the journey of our life. And in this week's Torah portion, Abraham and Sarah get new names. Until this, earlier in the portion, they were Avram and Sarai, but God changes their name to give them a new status in the world. Now, Rashi teaches that Avram means Av Aram, the father of the Aramean nation. That's where Abraham came from. And that Sarai means my princess. And when he changed their names to Avraham, he was indicating, you are not just the father of Aram, you are the father of many nations. And when he changed Sarai's name to Sarah, he was saying, you are not just a princess of the Chaldeans, you are a mother of all. Because at this turn on their journey, they were starting to spread a new theology in the world, monotheism. And in order to do that, God felt they needed new names. If we turn to page 89 in the Chumashim, verse 5, God is speaking to Abraham, and he says, "And you shall no longer be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I make you the father of a multitude of nations." Now, as soon as he does that, he goes on to describe, and he says it more than once, that as part of this new deal of earning this new name, Abraham has to circumcise himself. And if you turn to verse 15 on page 91, and God said to Abraham, "As for your wife Sarai, you shall not call her Sarai, but her name shall be Sarah." He then goes on to say that she will be blessed with a son. Part of the deal with Sarah earning her new name is she will experience pregnancy and childbirth at the age of 90. When we undergo changes, there are gains, but there are also losses. For example, now that I am Rabbi Zelony, there are some freedoms that I lose. There are probably some things that you would not want to see your rabbi do because of the title that she holds that is now a part of her name. I will leave it up to your imagination because I'm sure it will be far more interesting. We don't always change our names through earning a title in school. Sometimes we change it by going through a life cycle event. We become someone's spouse, or we become someone's parent. And as astounding and wonderful as it is to gain a new family member, there is a gain, but there is also a loss. Sometimes it's relatively minor, choosing not to keep a particular food in the house because our spouse is allergic. But sometimes the loss can be pretty major, like putting your spouse's career ahead of your own because the family needs to live in one city. There's a loss there, and you don't necessarily have to go through a life cycle event to turn that corner on your journey and have a new identity. Going from child to teenager means that you have increased freedoms, but a loss of innocence. Or going from adult to elder, well, you have gained wisdom and perhaps some more leisure time, but your physical health starts to fail, and sometimes your mental facilities as well. There is a gain in the change in status, but there's also a loss. And there are two midrashim about Sarai's name changing that express what do we do with a loss when we go through a transition. The first one says, so Sarai in Hebrew is spelled Sin Resh Yud. So when God took the Yud off of her name, it flew up to heaven in protest. And it said, "Thank you very much, but I liked being part of the destiny of the Jewish people. What are you going to do for me now?" And God looked at the Yud and he thought about it and he said, well, down the road, in the future, there will be a man named Hosea. And Hoshea will become the leader of the Jewish people after Moses. And when that happens to him, he will become Yehoshua. So you can be the Yud in Hoshea's name. When we've gone through a transition, it can sometimes be helpful to look back at the younger generation or people who are less experienced than us to realize all that we have lost and all that we have gained. When I look at rabbinical students and see the things that they're struggling with, I realize how far I've come. Or if a teenager were to look at a child, they might have a pang for the ability to simply play and not be responsible for chores or something like that, but they would also realize how much they've grown and how close they are to their own independence. So sometimes the point of losing the yud, of making the change, is that it goes back down to the next generation or the next people rising up, and that's a good opportunity for us to appreciate our own growth and change. The other midrash comes from the Yerushalmi, the less popular Talmud. And so what it says is, Sarai never really lost anything. In order to understand this midrash, you must know that Hebrew letters have numerical values. Yud's value is 10. Hey's value, which becomes the new letter at the end of her name, is 5. So Sarai's Yud broke into 2 pieces, 2 Hey's. And she took one at the end of her name, and she gave the other to her husband, Avraham. And the lesson I take from this about change and loss is that perhaps you don't lose anything. Perhaps you are simply uncovering and allowing to shine a quality that has always been there. You always had the capacity to be a wife. You always had the capacity to be a rabbi. You always had the capacity to be an elder. And as time goes on, you simply let those qualities move forward. I also found a text in Genesis Rabbah about the irritation we feel when someone won't recognize that we have gone through a transition, that we're trying to make a change in our life. And what it says is, anyone who calls Abraham Avram has transgressed a negative commandment and a positive commandment. It doesn't mean a good commandment or a bad commandment. A negative commandment is when God asks us not to do something. Don't eat pork, as opposed to a positive commandment where God asks us to do something. Do light Sabbath candles. So if we call Abraham Avram, we have been told, so the pasuk is, you will no longer be known as Avram. That's transgressing a negative commandment. Don't call him Avram. You will be known as Avraham, right? You will take on this new commandment to call him Avraham. And I think the point of this midrash is it's really hard to change. And particularly at the beginning of a transition or recognizing a new part of ourselves, we feel a little shaky. And anytime someone tries to bring us back to the past, it's frustrating. If my little sister came in here and said, oh, don't call her Rabbi Zelony, call her Lala, that would change the gravitas of the room. Right? I could not perform all of the functions that we need me to perform as the rabbi in the community, at least not with a straight face anymore. But one of the most beautiful midrashim, or commentaries of all, compared the change in the name of Abraham and Sarah to the change in name that Jacob had. So Jacob wrestled with the angel, and he became Yisrael. But unlike Abraham and Sarah, who for the rest of the Torah, that is what they are called, he's sometimes called Jacob, and he's sometimes called Israel. It bounces back and forth. And you could read this negatively, that he never grew into his new identity. He was never quite comfortable with it. But Kli Yakar, one of the commentators, reads it in a more positive light, and he says, just because you've taken on a new attribute doesn't mean you have to get rid of all of the past attributes. And so sometimes Jacob needed to be Jacob, and sometimes he needed to be Israel. And you know what? When I go home and she calls me Lala, it feels pretty good. I can be both. So we've talked about change this morning. We've talked about how when we transition, there are losses as well as gains. We've talked about what do we do with those losses. Sometimes we can admire them in a younger generation or someone who's not quite as far along in their journey and feel good about our growth. Or sometimes we can say, actually, it wasn't a loss. It was just allowing other of our qualities to come forward. We've talked about sometimes people are challenged by our new identities, our new turn in the journey, and so we have to stand tall and affirm our identities. But perhaps the most positive way to be of all is to realize that you don't have to let go of everything you were to become who you're going to be. So my prayer for us is that we all experience transition, change, and growth, that we all find our own way of being comfortable with it, and that those who are around us honor the changes we're trying to make. Shabbat Shalom.